In 32 years of watching the American military prepare for wars it hoped it would never fight, I participated in classified war games whose results were never supposed to leave the room. I know what that feels like. The specific institutional discomfort of sitting in a secure conference room and watching a simulation end in a way that nobody at the table wants to report upward. The silence that follows. The way senior officers look at the floor. The specific language that appears in the after-action summary. Language carefully chosen to describe catastrophic failure in terms that sound like valuable learning opportunities. I have been in that room. I know that silence. And tonight, in a document whose transmission to individuals outside the classification system represents the most significant national security leak since the Pentagon Papers, that silence has been broken. The results of 18 classified Pentagon war games conducted between 2018 and 2024, war games whose specific scenarios all involve American military response to Chinese military action against Taiwan, have been transmitted to journalists, congressional staffers, and foreign intelligence services in a document whose authenticity American intelligence has confirmed. The document's summary conclusion is stated in one sentence. In every simulation conducted across every scenario modeled, with every force configuration tested, the United States loses, not loses narrowly, not loses under specific adverse conditions, loses comprehensively, repeatedly. In simulations run by the most sophisticated military modeling capability on Earth, staffed by the most experienced military analysts in the American system, using the most current intelligence assessments of Chinese military capability available, America loses every time. And the specific ways it loses, the decision points where the simulation diverges from American victory, the capabilities that fail to perform as doctrine assumes, the assumptions that the models consistently falsify, have been documented in detail, whose public release represents the most consequential strategic intelligence gift to Beijing that any document in American history has provided. Tonight I want to walk you through what those war games found, not the sanitized version that congressional testimony provides, the version that produced the silence in those rooms. Tonight I want to answer 4 questions that the leaked document raises and that nobody in the mainstream defense commentary is answering with the honesty American national security demands. First, what specifically happens in the simulations that produces American defeat? Walk me through the specific decision points, the specific capability failures, and the specific assumption falsifications that cause every simulation to end the same way, and explain why 18 consecutive simulations produce the same result, rather than the distribution of outcomes that genuinely balanced military competition produces. Second, why has this been classified for 6 years? What specific institutional interests have been served by keeping the simulation results from the congressional oversight, the public debate, and the procurement decisions that honest war game results should inform? And what decisions were made differently because the results were classified than would have been made if they had been public? Third, what does the leak tell us about the institutional health of the American national security system? Who leaked this document, why now, and what does the decision to transmit classified war game results to journalists and foreign intelligence services tell us about the internal fractures in the American military establishment that the results themselves document? And fourth, what does a military establishment that has been losing every China simulation for 6 years do differently on the day after the results become public? And what does the gap between what the simulations prescribe and what the current budget, procurement, and force structure actually provides tell us about the distance between American strategic reality and American strategic rhetoric? Stay with me, because the answers describe an institutional failure whose public revelation may be the most consequential development in American national security since the fall of Saigon. If you came here for the analysis from someone who has been in those rooms and understands what the silence means, subscribe now, hit like, share this with every American who assumes that the most powerful military in the world is prepared for the war it is most likely to fight. Leave your assessment in the comments. I read everyone. Now let us get into this completely. Let me start with what actually happens in the simulations, because the leaked document's summary conclusion that America loses every time requires the specific operational explanation that the summary does not provide. Saying America loses is not analysis. Understanding why America loses is, and the why, documented across 18 simulations whose scenarios varied in timing, in warning, in force configuration, and in Chinese operational approach, reveals a consistent pattern of failure whose specific elements are more alarming than the summary conclusion. The simulations begin with the same basic scenario. China initiates military action against Taiwan, either through a blockade, an amphibious assault, or a combined air and missile campaign designed to compel Taiwanese capitulation without requiring a ground invasion. American forces respond in accordance with current doctrine. Carrier strike groups move toward the Taiwan Strait. Air assets surge from bases in Japan and Guam. Submarine forces position for interdiction, and diplomatic efforts mobilize Allied support. The simulations then model the interaction of those opposing forces across a campaign whose duration ranges from days to weeks, depending on the specific scenario. The failure pattern that produces American defeat is not a single catastrophic event. It is a cascade, a sequence of assumption falsifications that each individually would be manageable, but whose combination produces the comprehensive defeat that 18 simulations have documented. Failure. Point 1. The missile salvo. Every simulation begins with a Chinese missile salvo against American forward bases in Japan, South Korea, and Guam, whose scale and accuracy exceeds the assumptions that American base hardening and missile defense investments were designed to address. The RAND Corporation's unclassified analysis, whose conclusions align with the classified simulation results, assess that China can deliver approximately 1,500 precision ballistic and cruise missiles against American regional bases in the opening hours of a conflict. American missile defense systems in the region, Patriot batteries, THAAD, Aegis ashore, can engage approximately 300 incoming missiles under optimal conditions, 1,500 incoming, 300 interceptable, the remaining 1,200 missiles reach their targets. In every simulation, the opening Chinese missile salvo destroys between 60 and 90% of American forward basing infrastructure, the runways, the fuel storage, the munitions storage, the communications infrastructure, before American air power generates its first combat sortie. The simulations start with American air power already defeated on the ground. Failure. Point 2. The submarine attrition. American operational planning for Taiwan defense relies heavily on submarine interdiction of Chinese naval forces, using the Virginia-class attack submarine's capability to destroy Chinese surface ships and amphibious vessels before they can deliver ground forces to Taiwan. The simulations model Chinese anti-submarine warfare capability at levels that American intelligence assessments have historically characterized as optimistic for China. The classified simulations use assessments that are not optimistic for China. They use assessments that reflect what Chinese ASW capability actually is, informed by the full intelligence picture rather than the sanitized version that public assessments provide. At realistic Chinese ASW capability levels, American submarines operating in the confined shallow waters of the Taiwan Strait face kill rates that deplete the available submarine force within days rather than the weeks that operational planning assumes. The simulations consistently show American submarine forces suffering attrition that removes them as an effective interdiction asset before Chinese amphibious operations complete. Failure. Point 3. The logistics collapse. American military operational doctrine is the most logistics intensive in the world. American forces require continuous resupply. Fuel, munitions, spare parts, food, at rates that reflect an operational philosophy built on the assumption of uncontested logistics lines. The Taiwan scenario does not provide uncontested logistics lines. Every resupply route from American continental territory to the Taiwan theater passes through airspace and sea lanes that Chinese anti-access weapons can contest at distances that conventional logistics assets cannot safely operate within. The simulations consistently show American forces running out of precision munitions within days of sustained operations, at consumption rates that the available resupply infrastructure cannot replace on the timeline that operational tempo demands. American forces do not lose in the simulations because they are outfought. They lose because they run out of the things that fighting requires. Failure. Point 4. The Ally defection. American Taiwan defense planning assumes that Japan will provide basing access, South Korea will provide support, and Australia will contribute forces. The alliance framework, whose combined capability provides the geographic and military depth that American forces alone cannot sustain. The simulations model Allied decision-making under Chinese pressure, with an honesty that American diplomatic assurances have never publicly reflected. Japan faces Chinese ballistic missile attacks on its territory within hours of American forces operating from Japanese bases. The Japanese government's willingness to absorb Chinese missile strikes on its cities in support of Taiwan defense, in a scenario where American forces are already being defeated, is modeled in the simulations based on Japanese domestic political dynamics rather than diplomatic commitments. The simulations consistently show Japan restricting American basing access within 72 hours of Chinese missile strikes on Japanese territory. Without Japanese basing, American air power loses the geographic reach that Taiwan defense requires. The simulation ends. America loses. I want to address the classification question with the institutional directness that 6 years of concealed strategic failure demands, because the classification of wargame results is not inherently inappropriate. Wargame results contain sensitive information about American capabilities, Chinese capabilities, and operational planning whose public release provides genuine intelligence value to adversaries. That is the legitimate argument for classification. It is not the complete explanation for why these specific results were classified at the level that prevented their transmission to the congressional oversight that determines defense budgets. The complete explanation requires understanding what decisions were made differently because the simulation results were not available to the decision makers who should have had them. Decision 1. The F-35 program. If congressional appropriators had known in 2018 that every Taiwan simulation ended in American defeat, and that a primary cause of defeat was the destruction of F-35s on forward bases in the opening Chinese missile salvo, the procurement calculus for additional F-35 purchases would have been different. An aircraft that is destroyed on the ground before it generates its first sortie does not need to be stealthy. It needs to be survivable, either through dispersal, through hardening, or through operating from bases beyond Chinese missile range. None of those survivability investments were prioritized in the defense budget decisions made during the 6 years that simulation results were classified. F-35 procurement continued. Base hardening received a fraction of the investment that the simulation results justified. The classification served the procurement program. Decision 2, missile defense investment. If congressional appropriators had known that the opening Chinese missile salvo overwhelms American regional missile defense by a ratio of 5-to-1, that 1,500 missiles cannot be stopped by systems designed to intercept 300, the investment balance between interceptors and base hardening would have shifted. More hardening, more dispersal, more resilience, the investment that the simulation results clearly prescribed. Instead, interceptor procurement continued to receive priority over the hardening investments that would have reduced the effectiveness of the missiles that interceptors cannot stop. The classification served the interceptor procurement programs. Decision 3, alliance management. If senior American officials had known that Japanese basing access was modeled as collapsing within 72 hours of Chinese missile strikes on Japanese territory, that the alliance framework on which Taiwan defense planning depends is less reliable under actual combat pressure than diplomatic commitments imply, the investment in diplomatic relationship deepening, in joint hardening of Japanese bases, and in the specific contingency planning whose absence the simulation results documented would have been prioritized. Instead, alliance management proceeded on the basis of diplomatic commitments whose operational reliability the classified simulations had already assessed as insufficient. The classification served the assumption that the alliance framework was adequate. Decision 4, logistics resilience. If the Senate Armed Services Committee had known that American forces run out of precision munitions within days of sustained Taiwan operations, that the consumption rate exceeds the resupply rate by margins that operational planning had not honestly assessed, the investment in logistics resilience, in munitions stockpiling, in distributed supply infrastructure would have been prioritized. Instead, precision munition production rates remained calibrated to peacetime demand plus a modest surge capacity. The classification served the budget arguments against expensive logistics investments. The pattern is consistent. The classification of simulation results that showed American defeat served the institutional interests of every program and every assumption whose inadequacy the simulations documented. Classification was not primarily a security decision, it was an institutional survival decision. I want to address the leak itself with the institutional analysis that a document of this sensitivity being transmitted to journalists and foreign intelligence services simultaneously demands. Because the act of leaking classified war game results is not primarily a security event, it is an institutional event, and the institutional fractures that it represents are as consequential as the strategic content it reveals. Let me walk through what the leak characteristics tell us about who transmitted it and why. The simultaneous transmission to journalists and foreign intelligence services. A leaker motivated primarily by public accountability, by the desire to inform the American public and Congress about classified results that should be informing public policy, transmits to journalists. A leaker motivated primarily by personal grievance or financial compensation transmits to foreign intelligence services. This leak was transmitted to both simultaneously. That combination suggests not a single leaker, but a coordinated transmission. Multiple individuals with access to the same document, making independent decisions to transmit it to different recipients at approximately the same time. The coordinated simultaneous transmission suggests an organized group within the American national security system, not a single disaffected official, but a network of officials who collectively decided that the classification of these results had produced strategic consequences whose cost exceeded the institutional obligations of classification. I have spent 32 years inside institutions whose internal culture I can read. The specific character of this leak, its simultaneous multi-recipient transmission, its authentication through official classification markings, its targeting of both public accountability and foreign intelligence channels, reflects the specific frustration of military professionals who have watched classified results be used to protect procurement programs and institutional assumptions, rather than to inform the strategic decisions that the results were generated to improve. This is not a foreign intelligence operation. This is an institutional intervention by people inside the American military establishment who believe that the classification of their work has made America less safe rather than more. The fracture that the leak represents, the fracture between the institutional incentive to classify results that challenge procurement programs and the professional obligation to ensure that strategic decisions are based on honest assessment, is the fracture that 32 years of my own career taught me is the most dangerous internal failure that any military organization can experience. Not the failure of capability, the failure of honest assessment, because a military that cannot honestly assess its own limitations cannot correct them. And a military that classifies the results of honest assessment to protect institutional interests is a military that has chosen the comfort of false confidence over the discomfort of genuine preparation. The people who leaked this document made a choice. It was not the right institutional choice. It may have been the right strategic choice. And the distance between those two judgments is the distance between the institution America has and the institution America needs. I want to address what changes in the wake of the leak with the operational specificity that 18 consecutive simulation losses prescribe. Because the public revelation of classified war game results creates an obligation to Congress, to the American public, and to the military professionals whose honest work was classified to protect institutional interests, to translate the simulation findings into the specific changes that honest assessment demands. The simulation results prescribe a specific set of changes. Let me walk through what they are and what the gap between what is prescribed and what currently exists reveals about the distance between American strategic reality and American strategic rhetoric. Change 1: base dispersal and hardening. The opening Chinese missile salvo destroys 60 to 90% of American forward basing infrastructure. The prescription is unambiguous. American forward bases in Japan, Guam, and the Philippines must be hardened to survive the missile salvo, whose scale the simulations document. Aircraft must be dispersed to alternative bases and bare base locations that distribute the target set beyond the concentration that the current basing architecture presents. The investment required: hardened shelters, dispersed fuel storage, alternative airfield development across the Pacific Island chain, is assessed at approximately $15 to $20 billion over 5 years. The current budget allocation for Pacific basing hardening, approximately $2 billion over 5 years. The gap between what the simulation results prescribe and what the budget provides is $13 to $18 billion. That gap represents the specific dollar value of the institutional decision to classify simulation results rather than use them to inform investment priorities. Change 2. Munitions stockpiling. American forces run out of precision munitions within days. The prescription is munitions production rate acceleration and forward stockpiling at levels that sustain operations through the campaign duration that Taiwan defense requires. The RAND assessment of required munitions stockpiling, consistent with the classified simulation results, identifies a minimum of $40 billion in additional precision munitions production and storage investment to reach the inventory levels that Taiwan defense planning requires. Current annual precision munitions investment, approximately $10 billion across all programs. Current inventory levels against Taiwan scenario requirements, assessed at 30 to 50% of what sustained operations require. The gap between current investment and required investment will take 5 to 8 years to close at maximum production rate, during which the Taiwan scenario remains a scenario whose simulation results America cannot change. Change 3. Logistics resilience. The resupply failure that removes American forces from effective combat requires the development of distributed logistics infrastructure, prepositioned fuel and munitions caches, alternative resupply routes, organic logistics capability that reduces the dependency on contested supply lines. The distributed logistics architecture that the simulations prescribe does not exist in any meaningful form in the current American military structure. Building it requires a doctrinal shift away from the just-in-time logistics philosophy that competitive American commercial practice has infected military logistics planning, toward the redundant, distributed, survivable logistics architecture that combat in contested areas requires. Doctrinal shifts in military logistics take 5 to 10 years to implement, even when they are prioritized. They have not been prioritized because the simulation results that document their necessity have been classified. Change 4. Alliance contingency planning. Japan restricts American basing access within 72 hours. The prescription is contingency planning for Taiwan defense that does not assume uninterrupted Japanese basing, that develops the alternative force postures, the extended range strike capabilities, and the autonomous logistics architecture that allows American forces to sustain operations without the Japanese basing, whose reliability the simulations document as conditional. That contingency planning does not exist in any meaningful form, because the simulation results that document its necessity have been classified. The cumulative assessment of the gap between what simulation results prescribe and what current investment provides is the most consequential strategic mismatch in American military history. Not because any individual gap is insurmountable, because the combination of base vulnerability, munitions shortage, logistics fragility, and alliance conditionality produces the comprehensive defeat that 18 simulations have documented. And correcting that combination requires years of investment that classification has prevented from being authorized. In Beijing, the leaked simulation results have provided the most valuable single intelligence document that Chinese strategic planning has received since the end of the Cold War. Not because the document reveals Chinese capabilities. Chinese planners know their own capabilities. Because the document reveals American institutional failures, the specific gaps between American capability and American doctrine, the specific investment shortfalls between current procurement and simulation prescribed requirements, the specific alliance conditionalities that American diplomatic communications have obscured. The simulation results confirm Chinese strategic planning's own assessments. That is not the strategic value of the leak for Beijing. The strategic value is the confirmation that American strategic planning is based on the same optimistic assumptions that the simulations falsify. An adversary whose operational planning is based on falsified assumptions is an adversary whose responses can be predicted with greater confidence than an adversary whose planning reflects honest assessment. Beijing now knows that American Taiwan defense planning is built on assumptions that American war games have already falsified. That knowledge is the most operationally valuable intelligence input to a Taiwan contingency decision that Chinese strategic planning has ever received. In Tokyo, the leaked simulation results have confirmed the specific concern that Japanese strategic planning has been managing without public acknowledgement for years. The simulations finding that Japan restricts American basing access within 72 hours of Chinese missile strikes on Japanese territory is not a prediction. It is a model of Japanese domestic political dynamics that Japanese strategic planners recognize as accurate. Japanese governments have known that the domestic political sustainability of absorbing Chinese missile strikes in support of Taiwan defense is conditional on American operational success. If American forces are being defeated, if the simulation's opening salvo is destroying American air power, and the Japanese public is watching Chinese missiles fall on Japanese cities without American military response being effective, the political calculus for continued basing access becomes untenable. The Japanese government has been managing the gap between its alliance commitments and its domestic political reality in classified channels. The leak has made that gap public, and the specific embarrassment of having the conditionality of Japanese basing access documented in a leaked American war game adds a diplomatic dimension to an already complex strategic reassessment. In Taipei, the simulation results have produced the most alarming strategic reassessment in Taiwanese history. Taiwan's defense planning has always assumed that American military intervention would be sufficient to defeat Chinese military action against the island. The simulation results document that assumption as false. American military intervention is not sufficient. It is not even close to sufficient. And the specific failure cascade, opening missile salvo, submarine attrition, logistics collapse, alliance defection, produces Chinese military success on a timeline whose speed exceeds the decision window available to Taiwanese political leadership for any accommodation before military facts on the ground preclude accommodation. Taiwan has been planning its defense on the assumption that American military intervention provides a winning scenario. The simulation results say otherwise. And the Taiwanese strategic reassessment that follows toward the indigenous military capability, the negotiated status arrangement, the accommodation with Chinese regional primacy that the simulation results make rational, is the strategic consequence that the simulation results, if acted upon honestly, were specifically designed to prevent by prescribing the American investments that would change them. Classification prevented those investments. The leak has revealed the failure. But revelation does not correct it. Only investment does. And investment takes years. I have spent 32 years in rooms where war games were played and their results were reported. I have seen results that alarmed everyone in the room. I have seen the language that is used to describe those results in ways that allow the institution to absorb them without changing. I know what that language looks like. And I know the specific cost of institutional comfort purchased at the price of honest strategic assessment. The 18 simulations whose results were leaked tonight are not a surprise to me, not because I participated in these specific exercises, but because the failure pattern they document, base vulnerability, munition shortage, logistics collapse, alliance conditionality, is the pattern that honest assessment has been producing for years. The surprise is not the results. The surprise is that someone inside the institution finally decided that 6 years of classification was too high a price for the institutional comfort it purchased. The American military is the most powerful organization human beings have ever created. It has more capability, more training, more technology, and more resources than any force in history. And in 18 consecutive simulations of the war, it is most likely to fight. It loses, not because it lacks the capability to win, because it has been investing in the capabilities that produce institutional comfort rather than the capabilities that the simulations prescribe. Here is the question I want you to think about and answer in the comments. When the most powerful military in history loses every simulation of its most likely war, and when the results of those simulations were classified for 6 years rather than used to fix the problems they identified, what does that tell us about the relationship between institutional self-interest and national security in the American defense establishment? Because from where I sit, having spent 32 years inside that establishment, the most dangerous enemy America has ever faced is not in Beijing. It is in the specific institutional choice to protect programs rather than prepare for war, and that enemy has been winning for 6 years. In every simulation. Tell me what you think. Like and share this if the analysis delivered the depth American national security deserves. Subscribe for the work that goes where the mainstream will not. I will see you in the next one.